Hey there, Prairie View. Thanks for joining us today on Facebook Live. And if you didn't know, today is Maundy Thursday. If you've never heard that term before, Maundy Thursday, that's understandable. Maundy Thursday is less well known than Good Friday or obviously Easter Sunday. Maundy Thursday is traditionally focused on Jesus washing the disciples' feet in John chapter 13 before his crucifixion. Now, normally we have a prayer night on Maundy Thursday at the church every year, the Thursday before Easter, and obviously that is not an option this year with the coronavirus. So like yesterday, I wanted to just briefly look at the events of the Thursday before Easter in Jerusalem. From the Gospel of Mark, where we've been studying for several months now. So, the Thursday before Easter in the Gospel of Mark is recorded in Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 72. And if you were there for the video yesterday, the events of Tuesday took up only 11 verses, or Wednesday, took up only 11 verses. So we have a lot more time dedicated to Thursday than we do to Wednesday. And in Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 72, we see three main settings where all of this is taking place. Setting number one is in the upper room. Setting number two is the Mount of Olives, or the Garden of Gethsemane, more specifically. And then setting number three is before the Council of Religious Leaders. So I just want to walk briefly through each of those settings. Again, it's a lot of scripture, so I'm not going to read it word for word, but you can certainly follow along as I kind of sum things up. So let's start in scene number one. That is the upper room in Jerusalem. This is Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 25. So as I read the passage earlier today, one of the things I noticed is that we again see Jesus in complete control of his situation. You see that in verses 12 through 16. Those verses really remind you of the triumphal entry. They remind you of Jesus finding that donkey, being in complete control of what his disciples were going to say and where they were going to go and what they were going to hear in response. We see the same thing here, that Jesus knows exactly what he's doing as he asks the disciples to prepare the upper room. He is in complete control of the situation. And that only continues in verses 17 through 21, where Jesus specifically, again, predicts his betrayal. He knows who it's going to be. He knows that Judas is going to betray him. The other disciples in the room, they don't know which one of them it's going to be, but Jesus does. Again, he knows exactly what's going to happen to him over the next few days. He knows exactly what is going to happen to him on this very evening in Jerusalem. We also see the Passover Meal. The Passover Meal, of course, dates back to the book of Exodus. That's when the Israelites would look back and remember, and even to an extent, reenact the deliverance that God gave them from slavery in Egypt. And if you remember the story well, if you're a student of the Old Testament, you know that the way the Israelites were marked as God's people the night of the Passover was the blood of a sacrificial lamb on their doorposts. That is how the judgment or the wrath of God would pass over them if they had that blood marking their house. So that's the meal that they're gathering to celebrate. That is a meal that Jewish people gathered every year to celebrate. And that's what's happening here in the upper room the Thursday before Easter. But then interestingly, Jesus takes the Passover meal, which had been practiced the same way for generations, and he changes it. And it's now referred to as the Lord's Supper, or communion. So basically, a new meal comes out of the old meal. It springs out of the old meal. And the reason for that is that there is a new deliverance coming from a new kind of slavery by a new kind of lamb. The deliverance that Christ is bringing is bigger than the deliverance that Moses ushered in, that God used Moses to bring about. This slavery is not just Egyptian chains, it's not just physical or economic oppression, but it is the slavery of sin itself. that Jesus is freeing his people from. And then as far as Jesus being the Lamb, Jesus is the Lamb. He's not going to go sacrifice some other lamb to accomplish this salvation or to mark his people apart from everybody else. Jesus himself is the Lamb. It's his blood that's going to be shed. It's his body that's going to be broken. He is the Lamb who will be sacrificed, and he is also the priest who sacrifices the lamb. He offers up himself to deliver God's people. So that is scene number 1 in the upper room. And then for scene number 2, we transition over to the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane. That's in Mark chapter 14, verses 26 through 52. Now we see a few different things happen here. The first is that we see the sheep scattered in verses 26 through 31. That includes, and maybe even is especially, the case for Peter. This is where Jesus specifically predicts that Peter will deny Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. So the sheep are scattering. Now, this is also the part where we see in the Gospel of John that Peter is the disciple who will soon cut off the ear of one of the soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so that makes it all the more ironic that Peter, this firebrand, this particularly zealous disciple of Jesus who is very vocal and very boisterous at times and maybe even a little bit obnoxious, he is the one who will deny Jesus 3 times. So all the sheep will be scattered. All the disciples will be scattered. And that includes especially Peter. And then you move to verses 32 through 42. And that's where you see Jesus' famous prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it is an incredibly moving look at Jesus' 2 natures as both fully God and fully man. We see him in complete unity with the will of the Father. He specifically prays, "Yet not what I will, but your will." So Jesus is in complete unity with the Father because Jesus and the Father are one. They are not of 2 separate wills. But then we also see Jesus' human nature simply in the fact that no human in their right mind wants to get crucified. And so we see both natures of Jesus at work in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, it's important to note that theologically, Christians have never believed that Jesus is 50% man and 50% God. Or in this case, we don't believe that Jesus was 51% God and 49% man, and the reason he went to the cross is because his godliness won out over his humanity. That is not what we believe. We believe that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. And we see both of those natures on display in this really moving way in the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, what we see is that Jesus is going to be crucified. He is obeying the Father's will. And then we see the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus. That starts in verse 43 and runs to verse 52. What we see there is that Jesus doesn't fight. Some of the other Gospels talk about how Jesus says, I could call down an army of angels and they could wipe you out. But he doesn't do that. Rather, he resigns himself to his arrest. And then he uses this interesting phrase, let the scriptures be fulfilled. Again, Jesus knows what he's doing. He knows what he's getting himself into. This is not just a mere set of coincidences, or this is not a case of Jesus' trip to Jerusalem gone wrong. He knows exactly what is happening to him, and he's viewing it as the fulfillment of the scriptures in obedience to God the Father. And again, he doesn't fight because, like we talked about in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus is giving his life as a ransom for many. This is not Jesus' life being taken away from him. Again, he's not the victim here. He is the willing sacrifice, offering himself up for the deliverance of God's people. And that's what we saw with the picture of the Lord's Supper as well, and the Passover. So Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. We also see this young man in verses 51 and 52 flee. Many people have read the Gospel of Mark over the years and wondered, who is this young man who is unnamed and ends up fleeing from the Garden of Gethsemane naked, ashamed and embarrassed and cowardly? And really, the theory goes that this young man in Mark chapter 14 is just representative of the entire group of disciples. They're all being scattered. They're all fleeing. They've all been reduced to cowards. Naked, fleeing, ashamed cowards is who the disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane. So then that takes us to scene number 3, the final scene. This is verses 53 through 72, where Jesus stands before the council of religious leaders. Now, Mark does make a specific point of bringing up that the religious leaders had basically hired false witnesses to testify against Jesus. And that is really cruelly and tragically ironic, given that throughout the Gospels, so much of the religious leaders' opposition to Jesus has revolved around obedience to the law, the Old Testament law, the law of Moses. And again, if you're an Old Testament student and you know your 10 Commandments, you know that bearing false witness is specifically condemned within the 10 Commandments. And yet the religious leaders do not hesitate to bring false witnesses against Jesus. These people who supposedly are so dedicated to upholding the law of God and are so scandalized by Jesus' supposed breaking of the law of God in the case of the disciples collecting food on the Sabbath or him healing on the Sabbath, they do not hesitate to completely ignore the law of God in their thirst for Jesus' blood. So that makes them cruelly and tragically ironic figures. It makes them hypocrites, to put it nicely. And once again, like we saw at the arrest, Jesus does not try to get himself out of this. If anything, his statement in verse 62 really kind of seals the deal. He says in verse 62, in response to the question, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus knew when he said that was going to rile up the religious leaders. He knew that he was just giving them ammo to get him crucified. But again, Jesus is not trying to avoid crucifixion. He's not trying to get himself out of this. And so he doesn't hesitate to tell them the truth about who he is, even if it means that he's going to die. And really, they cry blasphemy. That's the biggest accusation they have against Jesus. But here's the thing about blasphemy. It's only really blasphemy if it's not true. So if I were to say the words that Jesus said, if I were to sit here and say that, yes, I am the Christ, and I am the Son of Man, and I am going to be seated at the right hand of power with the clouds of heaven, if I said that, that's blasphemy, because it's not true of me, but it is true of Jesus. And so when Jesus says this, it's not blasphemy. But the religious leaders fail to believe in him. They take it as blasphemy. And in the Old Testament, blasphemy is a crime punishable by death. So that's when they become convinced that they have got to get Jesus crucified. They finally have the charge against them. Now they just need to find a way to actually execute the plan. And that's where we'll pick up tomorrow, on Friday. Again, on Thursday, I would say the biggest takeaway is that Jesus has been left alone. That's the biggest takeaway, that Jesus has been left alone. We see that he's been betrayed by Judas. We see that the sheep, the disciples, have been scattered. We see that Peter has denied him. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, as Jesus is praying in this incredibly vulnerable, monumental moment in his life, the disciples are sleeping. Jesus is alone at this point. And maybe that's how it should be at that sense, at this moment, because really only Jesus can do what needs to be done. Only Jesus can do what is about to be accomplished on the cross. So, as he said, back when he was being arrested, in verse 49, let the scriptures be fulfilled. And those scriptures will be fulfilled. Tomorrow, on Friday, the religious leaders are going to take Jesus before Pilate, and the execution they were hoping for becomes a reality as Pilate will sentence Jesus to crucifixion. That is what we call Good Friday, and we'll talk a little bit more about why we call that Good Friday. It's a day full of ironies, and we'll explore that a little bit tomorrow. But again, I hope this has been helpful to you. Like I said, typically we like to have a prayer night on the Thursday before Easter. That isn't possible this year, so I thought it might be a good use of our time just to spend a few minutes examining what Mark has to say about the events of Thursday before Easter. So, I'll see you again tomorrow. We'll do another one of these video devotionals, and I certainly hope that your Thursday evening you can spend some time in thought and reflection and prayer about what it is that Jesus went through the Thursday before Easter. The Passover Meal, the Lord's Supper with his disciples, the denial by Peter, the sheep being scattered, and then, of course, his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and his trial before the religious leaders. He did this all voluntarily. He did this all in obedience to the Father, in unity with the Father's will. He did this all so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. He did this all to give his life as a ransom for many, and that many includes all who believe in him. You, me, all who believe in him. So again, think about that this Thursday before Easter, and we will see you again tomorrow on Good Friday.